At the end of the 1160s, 100 years after the Norman conquest of England, a medieval scribe, now only known to us from an anonymous source, was writing a manuscript. As he dipped his feather quill into the pot of ink, he was thinking about a great tale that had taken Christendom by storm. With great excitement, he set his pen to the page. Whither has not the flying fame spread, and familiarised the name of Arthur the Briton, even as far as the empire of Christendom extends? Who, I say, does not speak of Arthur the Briton, since he is almost better known to the peoples than to the Welsh and the Cornish, as our palmers returning from the East inform us? The Eastern peoples speak of him, as do the Western, though separated by the width of the whole earth. Rome, queen of cities, sings his deeds, nor are Arthur's wars unknown to her former rival Carthage. Antioch, Armenia, Palestine, they all celebrate his acts. As we shall see, in a short space of time, the legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table spread across the courts and taverns of Europe. Young men ambitious for glory pursued the paths laid by Gawain, Kay and Galahad. Ladies hoped for trysts with noble heroes such as Tristan and Lancelot. Even monarchs donned the mantle of Arthur returned. Something about these tales and characters captured the imagination. They touched on a vital nerve. And that spirit has continued to fascinate the folk of Europe. From our vantage point today, we can look back and see Arthuriana as a living, breathing tradition that stretches over a millennium. From Brittonic tribes to romantic artists, medieval kings to American presidents, there has been a fascination with the deeds of this rather obscure man at the edge of the world. Several of the great talents have felt compelled to retell the legend of Arthur and his knights for their own age. In him, they recognised a meeting point of history and myth, glory and tragedy, the particular and the universal. In Arthur, they encountered the depth and breadth of human experience. This King Arthur Day, thinkers and creators have come together for a special purpose. At this virtual round table, what unites them is a love for Arthuriana. Together, we want to explore and celebrate with you this tremendous historical, literary and artistic tradition. We hope to contribute to this legacy that we have inherited, pushing it further, articulating its verve and vim and power for our own age. Through doing so, we may begin to understand why Arthur has been such a prevalent figure in Anglo and European culture for over 1,000 years. In this video, we are going to open our journey into Arthurian legend. As we unravel the core ideas and developments that are found within the matter of Britain, the different elements of the day will be introduced. Take this video then as a key to both the chronology and themes of Arthuriana and for the upcoming programme. The geographical extent of the 12th and 13th century Arthurian craze, referenced at the start of this discussion, is manifest in the tradition's earliest pictorial representations. In the heart of northern Italy lies the city of Modena. In the year 1099, the community began the building of a cathedral. The initial design was developed by the architect Lanfranco. He produced an impressive structure that combined classical and Gothic features, its spire rising high over the surrounding area. At its northern end sits the Fish Market Gate, a rectangular door crowned with a magnificent archivolt. Across its crescent form is depicted an exciting scene. Marduk, of the dolorous tower holds the fair woman Winlogi captive. Several knights on horseback charge the fort in a desperate attempt to save the damsel in distress. Among their number is one Artus Britanni, Arthur the Briton, who urges his companions onward. The story depicted on the Duomo di Modena was recorded more fully in the 12th century Life of Gildas, written by the Welsh monk Caradoc. It tells of how Arthur ruled over the British Isles, conquering his enemies in bloody warfare. A minor king, Malwas, chose to kidnap Arthur's queen, Guinevere. Abducting and defiling his victim, he took her to his castle at Glastonbury. Enraged, Arthur assembled his warriors and laid siege to Malwas's stronghold. Before blood could be spilt, Gildas, a monk at Glastonbury Abbey, intervened. He persuaded Malwas to release Guinevere on the condition that Arthur's forces withdrew and let the matter rest. Peace was restored once more to Britannia. There are analogues to this tale in Old Welsh verse. Contained in the 14th century Book of Taliesin, there is a poem that dates to around 900 AD, entitled Praedhu Anhwyn, the spoils of Anhwyfyn. It tells of an expedition led by King Arthur into the fairy otherworld. With 3 ships, they sailed against the glass fortress of 4 peaks, battling 6,000 elfin sentinels. They stole a magical cauldron that belonged to the chief of Anhwyfyn, which produces abundant food for the noble of heart and inspires the poet's imagination. There they encountered Gwyr, a man who, set in chains, had been forced to sing before the treasures of the fairy folk until the Last Judgment. Did they rescue this beleaguered soul, trapped in the underworld for thousands of years? The text does not say. Nonetheless, he may be connected to Mabon ap Mordron, who in Culhwch ach Olwen, another Welsh poem dating to the 1100s, was the only man able to hunt a legendary dog. He is held captive in Gloucester Castle. Kai and Bedwyr hear him singing through the prison walls a song of lament. While Arthur and his men assault the fort from the front, Kai and Bedwyr stealthily enter the castle from the rear and rescue Mabon. These Welsh legends typify the earliest traditions surrounding King Arthur. It is true that the 9th century monk Nennius, building upon a 6th century sermon delivered by the aforementioned Gildas, reported in his History of the Britons that there was a figure named Arthur, a commander who led a coalition of British tribes against the invading Saxons during the 5th century. He won a series of 12 battles fought across the length and breadth of Britain, culminating in the triumph at Baden Hill. These and other references leave open the tantalising possibility that there was a historical Arthur. As we shall see throughout the day, a range of candidates have been suggested. Was he Arthur mac Aidan, Prince of Dalriata, associated with a place named Baden? Was he Arthwys ap Moerig, Prince of Gwent, a region home to the Arthurian citadel of Caerleon? Was he another Arthur from the heroic age? Or was he a figure of fiction? If there was a historical Arthur, known for great deeds, his exploits were quickly lifted into the mythological plane. Prior to 1100, most Arthurian tales tell of a band of warriors battling giants, hags, and enormous beasts. He, Kai and Bedwyr stand as a mighty fortress against those supernatural and demonic forces which seek to break into and conquer human civilization. They are champions seeking treasure and glory, raiding the fairy otherworld for magical trinkets. But more than anything, these men loved the contest of battle, Arthur relishing and enjoying his fight with the man-eating giant of St. Michael's Mount and the giant Ritho of Snowdonia. This variation of Arthur, influenced by Irish legends surrounding the mythical Finn MacCool, is akin to the Old English character of Beowulf. Both Arthur and Beowulf seek honour and fortune by slaying trolls and witches. They defend the realms of men from supernatural powers. They value combat as an end in itself. And both, as we shall see in the case of Arthur, wrestle and eventually succumb to tragedy. The ancient Britons held Arthur in high regard, holding him as the ideal of military prowess. Though once their tribes inhabited from Land's End to Edinburgh, Saxon and Irish groups gradually supplanted them in the north and east. The remnants were hemmed into Wales and Cornwall, with exiles taking residence in Brittany, in time developing into the ethnoculture of the Bretons. It has been suggested that the Bretons played a key role in the dissemination of Arthurian legends across Christendom. Cultivating a strong bardic tradition, Breton troubadours, often in the company of Norman and crusading knights, travelled the continent, performing in courts and cities across the Christian world, perhaps even in the Holy Land, perhaps giving some credence to the idea that in Palestine, for example, the name of Arthur was being heard. There they recited the Celtic tales and magical legends regarding Arthur and his battles with magical creatures and monstrous foes. By their hand did the traditions of a marginal culture on the edge of Europe rise to captivate the hearts of the high and low in the 11th and 12th centuries. Their efforts were supercharged by the arrival of a text that proved to be decisive in medieval Europe. Around 1136, Geoffrey of Monmouth, a monk of Breton descent whose origins may have been connected to Wales or Brittany, produced the history of the kings of Britain. Drawing on sources such as Nennius's History of the Britons, Geoffrey sought to provide a complete history of the kings and queens of the British Isles, beginning with the foundation of Britain by the legendary Brutus of Troy. Roughly half the work is dedicated to exploits surrounding the origins and life of King Arthur. Faced with a divided land, Arthur, by might of arms, unites Britain under his banner. Having subdued the lords of England, Scotland and Wales, he then heads east, drawn into conflict with the Roman Empire, a story perhaps inspired by the doomed coup of Magnus Maximus. Arthur establishes a mighty empire, rivaling the scale of Charlemagne's lands. Geoffrey's Arthur is the kingdom builder. He is Brutus reborn, channeling the same spirit that founded Britain. He thereby breathes new life into its failing order. He is the Charlemagne of the British, holy and just, magnificent and terrible. Geoffrey's history, as well as his writings on Merlin, spread like wildfire. Within a few years, French and Old English first translations had been completed, adding to the tale Arthur's sword Excalibur and the Round Table. Hundreds of copies were produced and circulated throughout Christendom. It would become the bedrock matter for the Arthurian tradition, both in terms of the historical information it yields and the literary and artistic works it gave rise to. And, strikingly, it had a direct impact upon medieval British politics. The work displays a remarkable degree of foresight on the part of the author. In 1138, about 2 years after Geoffrey finished his manuscript, England was plunged into civil war. King Henry I died in 1135 without leaving an established heir, leading to fierce fighting between rival claimants. The factions held on to parts of the country, the rest in the hands of barons who chose not to take a side. For several years there was a complete breakdown of political control and the social order, as the conflict left the maintenance of justice untended. For this reason the period is often called the Anarchy, with thugs and bandits roaming and terrorizing natives. Only in 1154, with the death of Stephen I, order was re-established by the newly crowned Henry II. He unified the barons under his rule, expanded his power in France, and established a more coherent and centralized legal system for the administration of royal justice. To his service he recruited men like William Marshal, a knight-errant who had excelled in tournaments across Europe, having defeated 500 knights during his tournament career. Inspired by the tales of Arthur and his Round Table, Marshal served his king with both military prowess and steadfast loyalty. The paramount of chivalry, he spared Richard the Lionheart when he was the only man to ever unseat the future king. Henry and William embodied the Arthurian spirit, a connection forged when Henry suggested shortly before his death that the ancient king and his wife Guinevere were buried at Glastonbury Abbey. Later monarchs stepped into the mantle beheld in Geoffrey's Arthur. Edward I and his wife Eleanor were avid readers of the Arthurian histories and romances. As we shall see later in the day, Edward styled himself as the successor to Arthur, both in the rituals he performed and in his conquests of Wales and Scotland. He reunited Britain and became the ideal of Christian kingship. His grandson, Edward III, also adopted an Arthurian aspect, placing at the heart of his court knightly orders and the chivalric code. He initially planned to found a round table, but in due course established the Order of the Garter, an exclusive union of champions dedicated to St. George, the hero of the English Crusaders. Towards the end of the War of the Roses, Henry Tudor presented himself as the fulfilment of a prophecy found in Geoffrey's Prophecies of Merlin. The wizard proclaims that the Saxons, symbolised by a white dragon, will rule over the Britons, represented by a red dragon, until the boar of Cornwall, Arthur, restores the natives once more. Given the ethnogeneses that took place before and after the Norman conquests, contemporaries began to equate the Britons with the Welsh and the English with the Saxons. Henry Tudor, descended from the Welsh through his ancestor Owen Tudor, claimed to be the descendant of Arthur and the rightful king of Britain. Taking on the aspect of Arthur reborn, he led his forces against King Richard III, defeating his foe at the Battle of Bosworth, donning as his banner the Red Dragon. Throughout his reign, he continued to reinforce the connection between himself and the ancient king of the Britons, naming his eldest son Arthur. These monarchs, found in Arthurian legend a suitable expression of the spirit they sought to inhabit, the king destined to forge Britain once more. At the end of the 12th century, the tale depicted on the archivolt atop the fish gate of the Modena Cathedral reappeared in a fresh form. French poet and troubadour Chrétien de Troyes, regular at the court of Marie of France, Countess of Champagne, told the court of Lancelot, a figure who had not appeared in Geoffrey's history. The poem recounts how Lancelot, greatest of Arthur's knights, rescued Guinevere from Meleagant, the Prince of Gore, the land of no return, a variation of Malwas of the Dolorous Tower. The romance focuses upon love. The unrequited desire of Meleagant compelled the fiend to kidnap the queen. The adulterous affair between Lancelot and Guinevere. Chrétien's story, beyond adding a literary sophistication and flair previously absent from the Arthurian tradition, wrestles with the arising ideal of courtly love within the circle of patronage sustained by Marie of France and her mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. The knight devoted himself in secret to his mistress, proving his love for her through the performance of trials she had set him. The love between the two became the knight's primary motivation, a man like Lancelot compelled to give his all for Guinevere. Love for her is what drives him. It consumes his being. When she demands he throw a fight, he throws it. When she reverses her decision, he defeats his foe. With Chrétien's introduction of Lancelot, who becomes one of the main figures in the French tradition, we see the emergence of the inner world in Arthuriana, the exploration of love in all its twisting threads. We see its ecstatic glories. We encounter its complications, the problems it poses for the knight bound to duty and honour. The illicit character of Lancelot and Guinevere's romance parallels the tale of Tristan and Isolde, leading to the latter's later inclusion in the Arthurian canon. Victorian artists, such as Gabriel Dante Rossetti, also found a powerful set of characters and scenes for their exploration of adultery and sex within Arthurian legends. They used the tale of Lancelot and Guinevere to draw out the passionate sensuality that coursed through secret trysts. However, their work also reflected the tension the lovers felt, both between each other and in relation to those whom they had betrayed. Nowhere is this clearer than in Rossetti's painting Arthur's Tomb. The picture references the end of Malory's The Mort d'Arthur, or The Death of Arthur, a text we shall see later on. Lancelot and Guinevere are positioned next to a stone tomb of Arthur, who had been killed in the wars that took place after the revelation of Guinevere and Lancelot's adultery. The knight leans over Arthur's dead form to kiss his beloved, consumed by passion and erotic desire. But she, clothed in a nun's habit, rejects his advance. The guilt and grief she feels is etched on her face, covered in shadow as Arthur lies resplendent in the sun. Lancelot's burning love is left unfulfilled, left to intensify as a beautiful but searing pain. Beyond his poem Lancelot, Chrétien wrote several compelling and influential romances, establishing Arthurian legend as a viable focus for great poetry and prose concerning knights going on adventures and quests. His other major contribution came in the form of his work Percival. Drawing on Celtic legends concerning magical cauldrons that supply infinite food, and the spiritual fulfillment found in the Eucharist, the Mass, the story tells of how Percival embarked on a quest for the Holy Grail. These motifs were supplemented by Robert de Boron's contemporaneous works, which detailed how Joseph of Arimathea brought the vessel used at the Last Supper and was used to collect Christ's blood on the cross to England, specifically to Glastonbury. The two accounts were synthesized in the masterly Lancelot Grail cycle, also known as the Vulgate cycle, given its immense popularity in the 13th century. In this latter version, we encounter for the first time the pinnacle form of the Crusader knight, Galahad. Where Lancelot fell to illicit love, his bastard son is the epitome of Cistercian piety, leading a life of humility and chastity, defending the weak from harm and showing mercy to his enemies. The pursuit of the Grail requires absolute purity, and so most of Arthur's knights are lost or killed in their quest. Their flaws, whether the anger of Gawain, the ignorance of Percival, or the adultery of Lancelot, hold them back. The Grail will not be theirs. But Galahad, the greatest knight in the world, the perfect embodiment of holiness and chivalry, is granted access to the cup of salvation and ascends into heaven. The Grail is the ultimate test. It exposes a man's heart. It tries what he loves, for it is the meeting point of God and humanity, the form by which Christ gives himself to Christendom. Thus, it made for the greatest treasure to be sought, especially in the age of Crusades, and notably Galahad is armed with a shield marked by the St. George's Cross, the emblem of the Knight Templar. But by the same token, the Grail breaks the seemingly noble court of Camelot. Even their chivalric prestige cannot hold up to the demands of the sacred. Richard Wagner's opera Parsifal pushes this dynamic in a new direction, exploring the destructive power of Eros and the healing balm of compassion in the trial of the Grail. But it was Charles Williams, member of the Inklings and good friend to C.S. Lewis, who most fully realised the centrality of the Holy Grail to Arthuriana. In his posthumous writings, we glean more fully the vision he laid out in the poems To Lysen through Logres and The Region through the Summer Stars, and for his unfulfilled Arthurian novel. Merging Britain with Byzantium, for Williams the central question was as follows: is the king to be there for the sake of the Grail or not? Tennyson's Idylls of the King clearly distinguish Arthur, a paragon of worldly justice, from the religious quest of Galahad. In that poem, Arthur rebukes most of his knights for embarking on a quest not meant for them, and as such, for harming his kingdom. But for Williams, the Grail is the centrepiece of Logres, an Arthurian name for Britain. Arthur's defeat of the pagans is a stepping stone towards bringing heaven on earth in the coming of the Grail. But it is Arthur's pride and Guinevere's illicit love that taint the land that should receive this holy vessel. The Grail is thus withdrawn, and shadow falls. The fall of Camelot brings us to the tragic nature of the matter of Britain. This aspect of the tradition may go back to the historical Arthur, the mid-10th century annals of Wales reporting that in 537 AD, Arthur and Mordred fell at the Battle of Camlan, leading to ruin and death in Britain. Similar to the melancholic elegies of Saxon poetry and the apocalyptic doom heralded by Norse mythology, the Old Welsh tales lamented the death of Arthur and his warriors. In the previously discussed Prydview Anhwyn, the following words are repeated throughout the poem. 3 fullness of Prydwen we went with Arthur. Except 7, none rose up from the fortress of the Mound. Though it was not clear that Arthur and Mordred were combatants in the annals of Wales, Geoffrey's history established their enmity. In a variation on the tale etched on the Modena archivolt, the history tells how Mordred, nephew of Arthur, took advantage of his uncle's absence from Britain when waging war against the Roman Empire. He took the throne and, either by consent or force, took Guinevere to be his queen. When he had heard the news, Arthur returned to Britain to confront his rebellious kinsman. In bloody battle they met, Arthur slaying the usurper. However, he was himself mortally wounded in the process. Thus, Arthur was taken by boat to the mystical Isle of Avalon, where fair maidens of an elfish nature tend to him in his slumber. This is the Iliad for the British people. The tragedy of Arthurian Britain persisted in later works, perhaps finding their fullest expression in Thomas Malory's aptly named The Death of Arthur, the inspiration behind the 1981 film Excalibur. Drawing on the French romances, English poems and Geoffrey's history, Malory synthesized the tradition into a single narrative. It was printed by William Caxton in 1485 and was a major success in Britain, going through multiple print runs up until the 18th century. Though Malory originally wished to give it a longer name, Caxton's shorter title identifies something important about King Arthur and his knights. Their fall is not an accident or a departure from the rest of the tale. From its very beginnings, Arthur's kingdom was doomed to failure, as are all heroic endeavours. The ravages of time, suffering and death, symbolised by monstrous foes, can be held at bay for a while. They can be resisted with noble courage and great feats of arms, but in the end, all men are swallowed by such a foe. So it was with Arthur and his knights, those who shone brightest, but were then brought lowest. In Malory's retelling, the exposure of Lancelot and Guinevere's affair is the inciting incident, splitting the Round Table and pitting Arthur and his most beloved and most wonderful knight at war with one another. Mordred takes advantage of the situation, and the resultant Battle of Camlan ends the golden age of Britain. Within Arthuriana, there is an unflinching recognition of the tragic nature of human existence. The legends recognise the reality of the Wheel of Fortune. Derived from classical depictions of the goddess Fortuna, by the medieval era the wheel had become a prominent symbol. In many versions, the Lady Fortune stands next to a wheel, spinning it by hand or with a crank. Around the wheel are 4 men, a king at the top who reigns, a man falling on the right who has reigned, a man at the bottom who is without a kingdom, and a man rising on the left who shall reign. The wheel can be interpreted in different ways. That each man or king will rise and fall as a matter of necessity, that our station in life is driven by an impersonal force, that our virtues and vices form a cycle that drives our moral and social station, and so on. Malory's Lancelot explicitly references the wheel with regards to his own fall from grace. Nonetheless, the whole tale can be seen through this lens. Whereas Geoffrey's history placed the conquest of Rome towards the end of Arthur's reign, leading towards the climax, Malory places it near the beginning. Camelot's rise is quick, but once it has reached its peak, the descent begins, slowly at first, before rapidly picking up speed. The only man to ever escape the wheel is Galahad, the pure knight who, on finding the Holy Grail, ascends into heaven. However, the Wheel of Fortune does not end in absolute defeat. Though a king may fall to the lowest rung, there is the promise that, by Fortune's hand, he will rise to the top once more. Though Arthur's golden age has fractured, there is the promise of his return. Though he sleeps on the Isle of Avalon, in Britain's darkest hour he will, with the Knights of the Round Table, ride forth once more. Growing from folk tales of the mythical wild hunt and the king under the mountain, there was a widespread belief in medieval Europe that Arthur would restore Britain and Christendom, the king adopting an apocalyptic role. Contemporaries reported that anyone who said that Arthur was dead in the presence of the Bretons would be lucky if they escaped being stoned. They believed he was in slumber, ready to wake up once more. Peter of Blois and Gildas Cambrensis said something similar, both suggesting that the Bretons treated Arthur just like the Jews waited for their Messiah. As we have seen, future leaders played on these beliefs. Henry VII presented himself as the new Arthur, riding under the banner of the Red Dragon. Upon ascending to the English throne, James VI of Scotland and First of England framed his reign as following in the footsteps of Arthur's unified Britain. In the 20th century, Jackie Kennedy referred to John F. Kennedy's presidency with reference to Arthur. Following her husband's assassination, she told in an interview of her husband's love for the musical Camelot, and she quoted the final lines of the closing number to describe his time in office. "Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief, shining moment that was known as Camelot. There'll be great presidents again, but then will never be another Camelot." In this vein, Arthurian legend made a decisive comeback in the Victorian age. Following the semi-opera produced by Henry Purcell and John Dryden, the legend of Arthur had lain dormant, a trend which had perhaps begun around the Tudor era, where parody and satire had infiltrated the tradition. However, in response to the injustices the British people faced under the materialism and exploitation that accompanied industrialization, thinkers like Thomas Carlyle and John Ruskin turned to the medieval world in search of truth, beauty, and goodness. It was within this countercultural context that Alfred Tennyson wrote Idylls of the King, a poetic rendering of Malory's classic. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood also engaged with the Arthuriana in their paintings, tapestries, and literary works. We've already seen that with Rossetti, and another figure who was prominent in this regard would be Edward Burne-Jones. Of that group, it was William Morris who re-established the Knight's Quest as a viable focus for storytelling. His novels, The Wood Beyond the World and The Well at the World's End, are about a quest, about a young man going on an adventure into magical lands and becoming a man. They rework Arthurian themes and motifs into original creations, telling tales of adventure, love, and heroism set within imaginary medieval worlds. In so doing, Morris contributed to the birth of the fantasy genre, establishing at its core the themes and motifs found within the Arthurian legends. The same search for what was expressed in the tales of Camelot inspired the Inklings. J.R.R. Tolkien began, but never finished, a poem entitled The Fall of Arthur, modelled on the Breton Lays. It depicts the splintering of the Round Table following the exposure of Guinevere's affair and Mordred's betrayal. He also translated and lectured upon the 14th century poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This poem ranks alongside the verse of Geoffrey Chaucer in terms of the creative output of medieval England. Beyond these creative works, The Lord of the Rings explores Arthurian themes and motifs, the character of Aragorn wielding a legendary sword, mirroring Arthur's renewal of his kingdom. Moreover, by placing the temptation of the ring as the fundamental struggle and conflict within the story, Tolkien is building upon an idea which he found in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which places a moral struggle at the heart of the tale. C.S. Lewis's science fiction dystopia, That Hideous Strength, more explicitly imagines modern Britain as a site of struggle between the demonic forces of industry, technology, and bureaucracy against a Christian remnant loyal to Logres, who are aided by the reawakened Merlin. As mentioned before, it was Charles Williams who most fully delved into Arthuriana, adding his own verse interpretations to the tradition before his untimely death. The legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table touch on a vital stream within Anglo and European history. They capture something of the land, the people, and the mood of the British Isles. They confront the core of our experience in an idealized manner, wrestling with love, the sacred, betrayal, and hope. They explore what it means to be human. The tradition's rich vitality has made it a source of inspiration for over 1,000 years, stirring heroes in each age to restore Britain to its former glory. This King Arthur Day, we return to Camelot so that Camelot may return to us. Let us drink from the deep magic. Arthur, the once and future king, will come again.